Cruz Wellwood and Cameron Moffat. In Langford, British Columbia, Kimberly Proctor was an 18-year-old high school student known for her friendly nature and aspirations to become a veterinary assistant. In 2010, she crossed paths with two individuals who would forever change her life and devastate her community. Kimberly represented everything positive about youth, with dreams of helping animals and a caring personality that endeared her to classmates and teachers. Cruz Wellwood, 17, and Cameron Moffat, 18, were troubled individuals from Langford who knew Kimberly casually through school. The pair had developed disturbing fantasies that they discussed extensively online, particularly through chats while playing video games like World of Warcraft. Their conversations revealed a dark fascination that would eventually manifest in reality, with discussions about harmful scenarios that should have been recognized as warning signs. The two lured Kimberly to Wellwood's home under false pretenses on March 18, 2010. What happened there over several hours shocked investigators and the community. Forensic reports detailed extreme harm, including binding. And afterward, they transported her remains by public bus to a wooded area near the Galloping Goose Trail. They attempted to destroy evidence by setting a fire under a bridge. Kimberly's remains were discovered on March 19, 2010, by a local resident walking their dog along the Galloping Goose Trail, not far from a bridge where the teens had attempted to incinerate her body. What drove these two to commit such an act? Psychological evaluations described both as individuals with psychopathic traits who had suppressed harmful urges for years. The motive appeared rooted in sadistic fantasies that had been developing for months, influenced by their discussions about harmful scenarios in online chats, where they shared increasingly disturbing thoughts and encouraged each other's darkest impulses. Moffat later claimed to be a former individual with certain compulsions that he had struggled to control. Investigators found no prior grudge against Kimberly. She was targeted opportunistically simply because she was accessible and trusted them. Disturbingly, evidence showed they attempted to lure another person to the same location just hours after harming Kimberly, suggesting they planned to continue. How were they caught? The investigation centered on digital evidence that proved crucial. Police intercepted text messages and reviewed online chats that revealed planning discussions, including Moffat's message about carrying out their plan. These digital communications provided a detailed timeline of their intentions and planning over several weeks leading up to March 18, 2010. The messages showed escalating discussions about carrying out their fantasies. Wiretaps later captured them laughing about what they had done while in custody, showing a disturbing lack of remorse and empathy. Both eventually confessed during police interrogations, providing details that only the perpetrators would know. Search warrants executed by the RCMP uncovered DNA and forensic evidence that directly linked them to the crime scene and corroborated their confessions. In their trial, both pleaded guilty to first-degree charges in October 2010. Judge Robert Higginbotham made the significant decision to sentence them as adults, lifting the protections typically afforded under Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act. This was a controversial but ultimately upheld decision. The evidence presented included video confessions where both showed minimal emotion, laboratory reports detailing the forensic evidence, and the incriminating wiretap recordings that showed their callous attitude toward what they had done. Sentencing occurred in April 2011, with both receiving life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 10 years. This meant they would serve at least a decade before being eligible to apply for release. The severity of the sentence reflected the calculated nature of their actions and the extreme harm inflicted on Kimberly over several hours. Years later, both have sought parole, but these attempts have been consistently denied. In March 2024, the Parole Board of Canada denied Cruz Wellwood's application for full parole, following a 2022 denial of day parole, noting that he remains a high risk for violent reoffending and has yet to complete required psychological programming. The board's important decision emphasized ongoing serious concerns about public safety and his inability to demonstrate genuine remorse or rehabilitation. In a video confession, Moffat stated he simply went along with it, showing a detached attitude toward his actions. At sentencing, Kimberly's aunt, Joanne Landolt, spoke about another potential victim who had declined their invitation, stating she was so very glad that girl didn't come over, she saved her own life. Kimberly's family has since become advocates for stricter youth sentencing laws in Canada, using their tragedy to push for legal reforms. Cruze Wellwood is currently incarcerated at Mountain Institution, a medium-security facility in Agassiz, BC, while Cameron Moffat is held at a separate facility to prevent collaboration. But while this case shocked Canada, the next would capture international attention through its connection to internet culture. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. In Waukesha, Wisconsin, a friendship between three individuals would take a devastating turn based on an internet fiction. On May 31, 2014, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, both 12 years old, lured their classmate Peyton Leutner to David's Park under the guise of playing hide-and-seek. What happened in that park would shock the nation. Leutner was harmed 19 times with a kitchen knife possessing a 5-inch blade, sustaining injuries to her arms, legs, torso, liver, and stomach. Medical reports later revealed one wound came within millimeters of her heart, and doctors stated that had it been slightly different, she would not have survived long enough to receive help. Despite her injuries, Leutner managed to crawl to a road where a cyclist found her. She underwent 6 hours of surgery and miraculously survived. What could drive such an act? The motive was rooted in an internet phenomenon. The two believed in Slender Man, a fictional character from online horror stories known as creepypasta, and thought he was real. They claimed he demanded a sacrifice for them to become his proxies, and that this would somehow protect their families. Planning had begun months earlier, with previous attempts that hadn't succeeded. The pair had researched the fictional character extensively online and believed wholeheartedly in his existence and powers, despite him being created as an internet horror story in 2009. Geyser was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and experienced hallucinations. Weier cited family circumstances as contributing factors to her state of mind. The case raised profound questions about mental health screening in schools, internet influence on vulnerable individuals, and criminal responsibility for those experiencing psychotic breaks. It sparked nationwide debates about how young people with serious mental illness should be treated in the justice system. Hours after the incident, police found both walking along a highway toward Nicolet National Forest, where they claimed they were going to meet Slender Man and live in his mansion. They confessed immediately, and the knife used was recovered. Their confessions included detailed descriptions of their beliefs and motivations, showing how deeply they had been influenced by the online fiction. The legal proceedings were complex. Both were charged as adults with attempted first-degree homicide, unusual for individuals of their age. Weier pleaded guilty to second-degree charges and was found not guilty by reason of mental defect. Geyser pleaded guilty to first-degree charges and was also found not guilty by reason of mental defect due to her schizophrenia diagnosis. Weier received 25 years in a mental health facility, but was released in 2021 with conditions including GPS monitoring and no contact with Leutner until 2039. Her release sparked significant controversy across Wisconsin and nationally, with Leutner's family expressing deep concerns about safety and questioning the appropriateness of the decision given the severity of what had occurred. Morgan Geyser remains institutionalized at the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. In January 2024, she petitioned the court for conditional release, but the petition was denied in April 2024 by Judge Michael Boren, who ruled she still poses a significant risk to herself and others. In a 2021 letter, Weyer wrote that she was sorry and stated she no longer hated herself. Expressing remorse for her actions, Leutner has shown remarkable resilience, stating that, "Without the situation, I wouldn't be who I am," though she has also shared that she sleeps with scissors nearby for protection. The case sparked international discussion about internet safety, the influence of online content on developing minds, and how the justice system should handle serious crimes committed by very young individuals with mental health issues. Weyer currently resides at her father's home under strict monitoring, while Morgan Geyser remains in secure custody at a state psychiatric hospital. There have been no documented recaptures or escapes in 2025, but she continues to seek legal avenues for release through her attorneys. While internet fiction influenced one case, the next would be driven by something far more common. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. In Arleta, California, jealousy between friends would lead to a tragedy that took years to solve. In 1985, Michelle "Missy" Avila, 17, was found face down in a stream in the Angeles National Forest, held under by a 100-pound log. The community was shocked, and her family devastated by the loss of a vibrant young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle had been close friends with Missy, but tensions had developed over relationships with certain individuals. The jealousy grew as they perceived Missy as competition for attention from people they were interested in romantically. What started as typical adolescent rivalry transformed into something deadly as resentment built over time and conversations about Missy became increasingly hostile. On October 1st, 1985, Severson and Doyle convinced Missy to go for a drive to discuss these relationship tensions. They drove to a remote area in the Angeles National Forest, far from help or witnesses. Once there, the conversation took a violent turn as the planned confrontation became something far worse than anyone could have imagined. Missy was pushed into the stream and held underwater until she could no longer struggle. The pair then placed a heavy log over her body to keep her submerged, ensuring she wouldn't be found easily. They left the scene and returned to their normal lives, with no one initially suspecting their involvement. Their ability to maintain this facade for years demonstrated a disturbing capacity for deception. What made this case particularly disturbing was the deception that followed. Both Severson and Doyle attended Missy's funeral, comforted her family, and even helped search for clues about her demise. They maintained the facade of grieving friends for years, all while knowing exactly what had happened to Missy and where her body lay in that stream. How was the case finally solved? The breakthrough came years later when a witness who had been reluctant to come forward finally provided information to authorities. This individual had knowledge of conversations and details that pointed directly to Severson and Doyle. The delayed tip proved crucial in reopening the investigation. With this new information from the delayed witness tip, detectives began building a case from scratch. They had to reconstruct events from 5 years earlier using memories, old statements, and any physical evidence that remained from the original investigation. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed old evidence, and eventually gathered enough to make arrests. In 1990, 5 years after Missy's death, both were arrested and eventually convicted of second-degree murder. The trial revealed the depth of the jealousy that had festered for months and the calculated nature of what they had done. Prosecutors presented evidence showing how they had planned to confront Missy about relationship issues and how that confrontation rapidly escalated beyond their original intentions. Both were convicted of second-degree charges and received sentences of 15 years to life. The sentence reflected the serious nature of their actions, but also recognized that it hadn't been first-degree premeditated from the start. During the proceedings, Missy's mother spoke about the devastating impact, stating that the pair had taken a part of me when they took her daughter's life. The family's victim impact statements painted a picture of a vibrant young woman whose life was cut short by jealousy. After serving approximately 20 years, both Severson and Doyle were paroled between 2011 and 2012. Their releases were controversial, with Missy's family and community members expressing outrage that they would be free after taking a life over something as petty as romantic jealousy. While Doyle has maintained a low profile, Karen Severson has faced ongoing public scrutiny. As of late 2024, she continues to be a subject of true crime documentaries and has been vocal about her release, though her attempts to profit from the crime remain a point of legal and ethical contention. The case highlighted how long-delayed justice can still be achieved through persistent investigation and witnesses finding the courage to speak up years later. It showed that cold cases can be solved even when years have passed since the incident. It also demonstrated how jealousy, particularly during formative years, can escalate to irreversible actions when not addressed properly. The next case would prove that sometimes the motive is even more inexplicable. Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaff. In Morgantown, West Virginia, Skylar Neese was a 16-year-old honors student with a bright future ahead of her. She was academically gifted and had dreams of attending college. She was best friends with Sheila Eddy and Rachel Shoaff, a trio that seemed inseparable. On July 6, 2012, Skylar sneaked out of her home to meet her friends, as captured on surveillance video. She would never return to the home where her parents waited anxiously for her. Eddy and Shoaff drove Skylar to a remote area in Pennsylvania, across the state line from West Virginia. There, in an isolated wooded location far from help, they turned on their friend. The pair harmed Skylar, working together in what prosecutors would later describe as a coordinated effort that showed planning and intent. They then attempted to conceal evidence by hiding her body under branches and debris. What was their motive for such a betrayal? When authorities finally extracted a confession, Shoaff provided what might be one of the most chilling explanations ever recorded. They did it simply because they didn't like her anymore. This shockingly banal reason left investigators, the public, and especially Skylar's family struggling to comprehend how friendship could end in such a way over something so seemingly trivial. For months, both maintained their innocence and actively participated in the search for Skylar. They joined search parties, distributed missing person flyers throughout the West Virginia community, and gave multiple interviews to local media expressing hope for Skylar's safe return. They posted on social media expressing concern, attended vigils, and comforted Skylar's parents, all while knowing exactly where she was. The deception was calculated and cold, requiring them to look Skylar's parents in the eye while hiding the truth. The breakthrough came when Shoaff had an emotional breakdown and eventually confessed to authorities. She led police to Skylar's remains and implicated Eddy in the planning and execution. Her confession provided the details investigators needed to charge both individuals. Shoaff pleaded guilty and received a 30-year sentence in exchange for her cooperation and testimony. The plea deal recognized her role in solving the case but still held her accountable for participating in taking Skylar's life. Sheila Eddy pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison with mercy, making her eligible for parole after serving 15 years, expected eligibility in 2028. The difference in sentences reflected the justice system's view of their respective roles and cooperation levels. The case led to significant changes in how missing persons cases are handled. Skylar's Law was enacted in West Virginia, requiring Amber Alerts to be issued faster when someone goes missing, rather than waiting the traditional 24 or 48 hours. The legislation recognized that in cases like Skylar's, where friends or family may be responsible, time is absolutely critical, and waiting periods can mean the difference between life and death. In May 2024, Rachel Shoaff was denied parole for the first time. The West Virginia Parole Board ruled that she must serve more of her 30-year sentence, and she will not be eligible for another hearing until May 2027. Both Shelia Eddy and Rachel Shoaff are currently serving their sentences at the Lakin Correctional Center in West Virginia. The senselessness of Skylar's case finds an echo in the next tragedy, where obsession played a central role. Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory. In East Moline, Illinois, Adrienne Reynolds was a 16-year-old who had recently moved to the area and was trying to fit in at her new school. She befriended several students, including Sarah Kolb and Corey Gregory, hoping to establish herself in her new environment. What Adrienne didn't know was that this friendship would cost her everything because of jealousies she wasn't even aware existed. On January 21, 2005, Adrienne got into a car with Kolb and Gregory. They drove to a remote location in rural Illinois, and what happened there shocked the community to its core. Adriana was harmed in the vehicle, and the pair then went to extraordinary lengths to conceal what they had done. They dismembered her body in an attempt to hide evidence and prevent identification, burning some remains in a fire pit at a farm and disposing of others in different locations across multiple counties throughout the region. What drove this horrific act? The motive centered on jealousy and obsession within their social circle. Kolb had developed an intense fixation on Gregory, and she perceived Adrienne as competition for his attention. The jealousy festered for weeks until Kolb decided to eliminate what she saw as an obstacle to getting Gregory's full attention. Friends later reported noticing increasing tension between the three individuals in the weeks before, but never imagined it would escalate so dramatically and violently. Gregory participated, whether driven by his own motivations or Kolb's influence remains debated. Both were connected to the goth subculture community, and investigators looked into whether this played any role in their mindset or actions. While it became a focus of media coverage, prosecutors ultimately argued the crime was driven by personal jealousy rather than any cultural influence. The investigation moved quickly once Adrienne was reported missing. Her disappearance prompted immediate searches, and inconsistencies in statements from Kolb and Gregory raised red flags as pressure mounted from intensive questioning and mounting evidence. Both eventually provided information that led investigators to the multiple locations where Adrienne's remains had been concealed. The extensive search required several days and multiple teams working across different jurisdictions. The confessions were crucial in building the prosecution's case. Both admitted to their roles, though they pointed fingers at each other regarding who had done what. The recovery of Adrienne's remains provided forensic evidence that corroborated parts of their accounts and refuted other claims. The trials were extremely emotional and drew significant media attention from across Illinois and nationally. The courtroom was packed daily with community members, media, and Adrienne's devastated family members who attended every session. Kolb was convicted and sentenced to 53 years in prison, while Gregory received 45 years. The sentences reflected the brutal nature of what they had done and the extensive efforts to conceal their crime. Victim impact statements from Adrienne's family painted a picture of a young woman who was simply trying to find her place in a new community. Her mother spoke of the devastating loss and the nightmares of what her daughter endured. The family's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Adrienne had trusted her attackers. Over the years, both have filed appeals challenging various aspects of their convictions and sentences. In 2024 and early 2025, Corey Gregory's petitions for a sentence reduction under new juvenile sentencing guidelines were reviewed. However, his 45-year sentence remains intact due to the brutal nature of the crime, which included dismemberment. Sarah Kolb is currently serving her 53-year sentence at the Logan Correctional Center, and Corey Gregory is serving his 45-year sentence at the Stateville Correctional Center, having been moved from Pontiac. Neither has shown the remorse that Adrienne's family hoped to see, according to statements made at parole hearings. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. If jealousy motivated one case, the next would reveal how online deception can lead to deadly consequences. Denali Bramer and Caden McIntosh. In Anchorage, Alaska, Cynthia Hoffman was a young woman with developmental challenges who trusted those she considered friends. In 2019, she became the victim of one of the most disturbing catfishing schemes ever prosecuted, orchestrated by people she believed cared about her. Denali Bramer had been communicating online with someone she believed was a wealthy man named Tyler, who promised her millions of dollars. In reality, Tyler didn't exist as Bramer believed. The online persona manipulated her into believing she could receive a massive financial payout if she carried out a specific task, one that would require the ultimate betrayal of friendship. The scheme was as simple as it was horrifying. Bramer was told she would receive $9 million if she provided photographic evidence of someone's demise. She recruited her friend Caden McIntosh to help carry out the plan, and together they selected Cynthia as their target, likely because they believed her vulnerabilities made her an easy victim who wouldn't suspect her friend's intentions. On June 2nd, 2019, Bramer and McIntosh took Cynthia on what was presented as a friendly hiking trip to Thunderbird Falls, a popular outdoor recreation area near Anchorage. Cynthia trusted them completely and had no reason to fear for her safety. The location was remote enough that they could carry out their plan without immediate discovery. At the falls, McIntosh shot Cynthia and they pushed her body into the water below. Bramer took photographs as proof to send to the person she believed was Tyler, hoping to collect her promised millions. The callousness of photographing the scene showed how completely she had been manipulated by the online deception and her own greed. How was this elaborate scheme uncovered? Cynthia's body was discovered relatively quickly, and investigators began piecing together her final movements and the people she had been with that day. Digital evidence proved crucial, with authorities tracing phone records and communications. The photographs Bramer had taken became key evidence proving premeditation. When confronted, both Bramer and McIntosh confessed to their roles. Their confessions revealed the full scope of the catfishing operation and how they had willingly participated in taking a life in exchange for promised money that would never materialize. The case highlighted the dangers of online deception and how financial promises from anonymous internet sources can lead vulnerable or greedy individuals to commit unspeakable acts. The manipulation was sophisticated enough that Bramer genuinely believed she would receive millions, though questions remained about whether she would have participated regardless. Both pleaded guilty to avoid trial, with Bramer receiving 99 years in prison. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of the crime and the betrayal of someone who considered them friends. In January 2025, Caden McIntosh was sentenced to 65 years with 15 years suspended, resulting in a 50-year term of active imprisonment for the murder of Cynthia Hoffman. While both received lengthy sentences, the disparity reflected the justice system's view of their respective roles in planning versus executing the scheme. Both will ultimately spend the majority of their lives behind bars. Cynthia's family spoke at sentencing about the devastating loss of someone who had overcome significant challenges throughout her life and deserved protection and friendship from those who would instead exploit her vulnerabilities for financial gain. They emphasized that Cynthia had trusted her attackers completely and never suspected the danger she faced from people she called friends. Both Bramer and McIntosh are currently serving their sentences in Alaska prisons. The man behind the Tyler persona was identified as Darren Schillmiller of Indiana. In January 2024, he was sentenced to 99 years in prison for his role in soliciting the murder of Cynthia Hoffman via the internet. While an online scheme motivated one tragedy, the The next case would stem from something far more personal. David Graham and Diane Zamora. In Grand Prairie, Texas, Adriana Jones was a high school student who had her whole life ahead of her when she crossed paths with a couple whose jealousy would prove deadly. In December 1995, she became the victim of a crime that shocked the nation and revealed the dark side of teenage romance. At the time of the murder in December 1995, Graham and Zamora were high school seniors. They successfully hid their crime for 9 months and were only arrested after they had begun their plebe years at the U.S. Air Force Academy and U.S. Naval Academy, respectively. They appeared to be the perfect couple with bright futures, but their relationship was marked by intense possessiveness and jealousy. Graham had a brief encounter with Adrienne, and when he confessed this to Zamora, her jealousy consumed her completely. Rather than addressing the situation through their relationship or moving on, Zamora became fixated on eliminating what she perceived as a threat. She convinced Graham that the only way to preserve their relationship was to take Adrienne's life. What made this case particularly disturbing was that Graham had fabricated details about his encounter with Adrienne. This lie would cost an innocent life. On December 4th, 1995, Graham lured Adrienne to a remote area under false pretenses. Zamora was hiding in the vehicle, and when Adrienne arrived, the couple attacked her. During the attack, Diane Zamora struck Adrienne in the head with a 10-pound dumbbell, and when Adrienne attempted to flee the vehicle, David Graham fired the fatal shots with a .22 caliber pistol. They left her body in a field, believing they had committed the perfect crime. For over a year, the case went unsolved. Adriana's family mourned without knowing who had taken their daughter, and investigators had limited leads. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source that would prove fatal to Graham and Zamora's carefully constructed facade. How were they finally caught? Graham began boasting about the crime to friends at the Air Force Academy. He shared details with fellow cadets, apparently unable to keep the secret of what he and Zamora had done. One of these friends eventually came forward and reported the confession to authorities, setting in motion the investigation that would bring both to justice. When confronted, both Graham and Zamora eventually confessed to their roles in Adriana's demise. Their confessions provided the details investigators needed to charge them with capital charges. The evidence included the physical evidence from the scene, their confessions, and testimony from the friend who had reported Graham's boasting. The trial revealed how jealousy had spiraled into murder. Prosecutors emphasized that Adriana was completely innocent and had been victimized over something largely fictional. Both Graham and Zamora were convicted of capital charges and sentenced to life in prison. Under Texas law at the time, they would not be eligible for parole until 2036, meaning they would serve at least 40 years before having the opportunity to seek release. The sentences reflected the premeditated nature of the crime and the complete innocence of their victim. The case became one of the most high-profile examples of crimes committed by military academy students. The military academies used it in ethics training. Adriana's family spoke about the devastating impact of losing their daughter to such senseless jealousy. They emphasized that she had done nothing wrong and was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, victimized by two people who let their toxic relationship dynamics lead to murder. Zamora is currently serving her life sentence at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit in Texas, while Graham is incarcerated at the Alfred D. Hughes Unit in Texas. Both maintain they have changed significantly since 1995 and express remorse for their actions, though Adrienne's family questions the sincerity given the calculated nature of what they did. Their first parole eligibility in 2036 remains decades away. While that case involved two individuals in a romantic relationship, the next would involve a friendship with far more devastating consequences. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. On April 20th, 1999, Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, became the site of an event that would forever change how America views school safety. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold carried out an attack that resulted in 13 people losing their lives, shocking the nation and sparking decades of debate about warning signs, prevention, and the factors that can lead individuals down such a dark path. Harris and Klebold had been friends for years and were considered by some to be outsiders at their school. They bonded over shared interests and grievances, and over time, their friendship became increasingly focused on dark fantasies and plans for revenge against classmates and society they felt had rejected them. They kept journals and videos documenting their preparations over more than a year. These materials later provided insight into their mindsets. What drove them to such extreme actions? Psychological analyses after the fact suggested different motivations for each. Harris was assessed as having psychopathic traits, showing a genuine lack of empathy and a desire to cause maximum harm. His writings revealed someone who felt superior to others and wanted to inflict pain on a society he viewed with contempt. He was likely the driving force behind the most extreme elements of their planning. Klebold appeared to struggle with depression and feelings of hopelessness, as revealed in his journal entries that discussed ending his life. He seemed more conflicted about their plans, though he ultimately participated fully. Both cited experiences with social rejection at school, though the extent has been debated. On that April morning, they arrived at school heavily armed with weapons they had acquired and built, including improvised devices that fortunately failed to detonate as planned. Had all their plans worked as intended, the casualties would have been far higher. The active shooting phase of the massacre lasted approximately 17 minutes after a period of wandering and attempting to detonate their propane bombs in the cafeteria. Harris and Klebold returned to the library and committed suicide at approximately 12:08 p.m. The aftermath was devastating and far-reaching for the entire community and nation. Families mourned the tragic loss of innocent victims who had simply been at school that day. The entire community struggled to comprehend how two students could carry out such an attack. And the nation began a conversation about school safety, warning signs, and prevention that continues to this day. They had made concerning statements and created violent content, though the significance wasn't fully recognized before the tragedy. The case led to widespread and permanent changes in school security protocols, threat assessment procedures, and law enforcement response strategies across the entire United States. Schools across America implemented extensive new safety measures and protocols, and law enforcement agencies developed specialized training programs for responding to active situations in schools. The Columbine effect influenced policy and practice in education and public safety for decades. Unfortunately, the case inspired copycat attempts. Law enforcement now monitors for individuals who reference Columbine. The victims' families have channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for better mental health services, improved threat assessment, and policies aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Some have become nationally recognized voices on issues of school safety and gun policy. Their loss continues to impact them daily, even decades later. Debates continue about what factors contributed to the tragedy. Some focus on access to weapons, others on mental health services, and still others on school culture, and how students who feel isolated are treated. Most experts agree that multiple factors likely played a role, and there was no single cause that could have been addressed to prevent what happened. The case remains one of the most studied incidents in criminal psychology, sociology, and education. Researchers continue to analyze the materials Harris and Klebold left behind, trying to understand the warning signs and what interventions might have made a difference. Their names have become synonymous with a type of crime that, sadly, has been repeated too many times since. While that case changed America forever, the next would reshape legal history in an earlier era. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb. In 1924 Chicago, Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were wealthy, highly intelligent young men from privileged families. Both were considered prodigies who had graduated from university at unusually young ages and seemed destined for successful careers. Instead, they would commit one of the most infamous crimes in American history. Leopold and Loeb believed they were superior beings who could commit the perfect crime as an intellectual exercise. They decided to carry out what they called a thrill kill, selecting a victim essentially at random to demonstrate they could commit a serious offense and evade detection. The victim they chose was tragic in its arbitrariness. Bobby Franks was simply a young person from their neighborhood who happened to be available when they were ready to act. On May 21, 1924, they lured Bobby Franks into a rented car, struck him, and later disposed of his body in a culvert. They believed they had planned every detail perfectly and would never be caught. However, they made a critical mistake. Leopold accidentally dropped his eyeglasses at the scene where they left the body. The glasses had an unusual hinge design that was rare, and investigators were able to trace them to just 3 people in the Chicago area. Leopold was one of those 3, immediately making him a suspect. When questioned, Leopold claimed he must have dropped the glasses during a recent birdwatching expedition in the area. However, as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies in the alibi stories provided by both Leopold and Loeb began to emerge. They had tried to create an elaborate cover story, but the details didn't hold up under scrutiny. The breakthrough came when prosecutors produced garage records showing that the Leopold family car, which the duo claimed to have been driving on the day of the murder, had actually been in the shop for repairs, directly impeaching their alibi. Faced with mounting evidence and contradictions in their stories, both eventually confessed to the crime, though each tried to minimize their own role while implicating the other more heavily. The trial became a national sensation because of attorney Clarence Darrow's defense. Rather than argue his client's innocence, Darrow argued against capital punishment itself, making an impassioned plea about youth, mental state, and the morality of state execution. Darrow made an impassioned 12-hour closing argument, arguing their youth and psychological issues should be considered as mitigating factors. The judge agreed with Darrow's arguments to the extent that he sentenced both to life in prison plus 99 years, rather than imposing the execution that prosecutors had sought. The sentence was controversial, with many believing that their wealth and privileged status had saved them from the ultimate penalty. Others saw it as a victory for arguments against capital punishment. Leopold later wrote about the crime, stating that committing the act was as easy as ordering a pie for breakfast, showing the disturbing detachment with which they had approached taking a life. This statement captured how they had intellectualized their crime rather than seeing it as the taking of an actual human life. Loeb was killed in prison in 1936 during an altercation with another inmate, ending his life at a relatively young age. Leopold, however, was eventually paroled in 1958 after serving 33 years. He moved to Puerto Rico, where he worked in hospitals and attempted to rebuild his life, dying in 1971. Bobby Franks's family was utterly devastated by the senseless loss and the terrible fact that the crime had no real motive beyond intellectual curiosity and the perpetrator's delusional desire to prove their supposed superiority. The complete randomness of his selection as a victim made the tragedy even more difficult for anyone to comprehend. His memory deserved better than to be reduced to an intellectual exercise by 2 young men who saw themselves as above moral constraints. The final case would show how deadly fantasies from entertainment could inspire real-world tragedy. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. In Pocatello, Idaho, Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk met as high school students and bonded over their shared interest in horror films. Both were obsessed with replicating the movie Scream in real life. The pair discussed wanting to achieve notoriety similar to Columbine, seeing themselves as potential celebrities. What made this case particularly chilling was their documentation of the planning process. Draper and Adamczyk recorded themselves on video discussing their plans in detail, creating evidence that would later prove crucial in their prosecution. In these recordings, they talked about their motivations, their plans, and their excitement about what they intended to do. Their target was Cassie Jo Stoddart, a classmate who considered them friends. On September 22, 2006, Cassie was house-sitting for relatives in Pocatello when Draper and Adamczyk came over to visit. Ostensibly as friendly visitors, she had no reason to fear. They had been to the house earlier to unlock doors and turn off lights, setting the stage for their planned attack later that night. After leaving initially, they returned to the darkened house wearing dark clothing and masks, and attacked Cassie with knives they had purchased from a pawn shop specifically for this purpose. The attack was brutal and sustained, showing their determination to carry out their plan. Cassie had no chance to defend herself against the ambush. She was harmed 30 times in the attack, indicating the prolonged nature of the assault. The scene was deliberately staged to resemble scenarios from horror films they admired. They believed they were creating something that would make them famous in the way the Columbine perpetrators had become infamous. How were they caught so quickly? The investigation benefited from several factors. First, witnesses had seen Draper and Adamczyk with Cassie earlier that evening, making them obvious persons of interest. Second, and most damning, investigators discovered the videos the pair had recorded documenting their plans. In these recordings, they explicitly discussed what they planned to do, providing irrefutable evidence of premeditation. The videos showed them discussing their desire to follow in their footsteps, referring to famous criminals like those involved in Columbine. They talked about wanting to be remembered and achieving notoriety through their crime. The recordings demonstrated not only their guilt, but also their calculated planning and complete lack of remorse before the act. Additionally, investigators found a death list in their possession that named other potential victims, suggesting Cassie may have been just the first in a planned series of attacks. This discovery emphasized the danger they had posed, and likely would have continued to pose had they not been caught. The trial was straightforward given the overwhelming evidence. The videos they had made essentially convicted them, showing planning, intent, and their motivations in their own words. There was little the defense could argue against such damning self-recorded evidence. Both Draper and Adamczyk were convicted of first-degree charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the calculated nature of their crime and the fact that they had specifically targeted someone who trusted them. The lack of any genuine remorse, as evidenced by their videos, also factored into the sentencing. Over the years, both have filed appeals challenging their sentences and convictions. Following a series of appeals through 2024 and 2025 regarding the constitutionality of juvenile life sentences, Miller v. Alabama, both Draper and Adamczyk remain in prison, though the Idaho Supreme Court has been tasked with reviewing whether their sentences constitute cruel and unusual punishment for crimes committed as minors. In 2024, Draper gave an interview, though he showed limited insight. Cassie's family spoke about the devastating loss of a vibrant young woman whose only mistake was trusting people she thought were her friends. They emphasized that she had welcomed Draper and Adamczyk into the house that evening, never suspecting the danger they posed. Her trust was betrayed in the worst possible way. The case prompted ongoing discussions about violent media's potential influence on vulnerable individuals, though experts consistently note millions consume such media without ever committing harm. Both Draper and Adamczyk are currently serving their sentences at Idaho State Correctional Institution. They will never be eligible for parole, ensuring they remain incarcerated for the remainder of their lives. Their case continues to be studied as an example of how obsession with fame and violent media can combine with existing psychological issues to create dangerous individuals. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.